China and the Philippines are likely to start joint explorations in the South China Sea after a thawing of relations between the two. What's behind the improvement and how will the likes of America react? Meanwhile, the US, Canada and Mexico are renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement in the hope of having something to replace the present one. What's at stake for the three countries? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. According to the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has given the green light to a joint exploration plan with China in disputed areas in the South China Sea. The joint venture project is likely to be started in a year. Meanwhile, the Philippine Bureau of Immigration confirmed on Thursday that they will soon issue landing visas to Chinese nationals who wish to visit the country, though this preferential policy is temporarily only enjoyed by certain types of visitors, including business travelers and athletes. So are we seeing an increasingly broader cooperation between China and the Philippines? How could the two sides benefit from the cooperation? Joining the discussion today from Manila is Professor Richard Haydarian at De La Salle University, and in Beijing, Aina Tangan, current affairs commentator. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. Professor Haydarian, what are the details of this joint exploration plan, and in what kinds of ways will China and Philippines be cooperating?
Well, as far as the Philippine official statement is concerned, Foreign Secretary Alan Peter Cayetano said not long ago that they're exploring because there are some legal and political concerns that have to be dealt with. But I think President Duterte made it very clear right after his State of the Nation address last month that that is his preference, that the way forward is, instead of confronting China, instead of challenging China, instead of getting help from allies against China, the best thing the Philippines can get is a joint development and joint exploration agreement. But of course, as they say, the devil is in the details. I think, there is at least a level of consensus within the political leadership in the Philippines that perhaps a joint exploration and joint development is the best modus vivendi that the Philippines can find in order to make sure that it also is able to exploit its own natural resources within its own 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone. The reason is that the Philippines has an energy security dilemma. In 2024, the Malampaya plant, which is close to Palawan, is expected to run out of natural gas resources. So the Philippines is looking for alternatives. But so long as there are disputes between Philippines and China, so long as there are security concerns in the Reed Bank, which is also in the Palawan area and within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, private sector companies which were given the contract to develop that area are a little bit hesitant to do that. So by October, there is an expectation per the announcement of the Philippine Energy Department that exploration will move forward. But I think in order to remove the security consideration, what the Philippines is looking at is to jointly explore the energy resources there with China. But this is going to be very complicated, and I'm sure we can discuss that further, because in the Philippine Constitution there are certain restrictions about joint exploration with foreign entities.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Aina, from the perspective of Beijing, what you're seeing here, what's the significance of this announcement, and what practical interest does China see in this joint exploration plan?
Well, the most important thing is that it's showing a breakthrough on what has been an impasse with ASEAN. Instead of going the route of trying to settle all issues with all countries at the same time, they've done it on a bilateral basis. So with this kind of, it could be a future template if it's done. Now, keep in mind, the Chinese government has neither accepted nor denied that this entente has been reached. They do talk about the energy issues, but now in terms of practicality, I mean, a lot of people look at Duterte and they say, oh gosh, he's all over the place. They don't like his war on drugs and things like that. But when you start looking at the finer details of this is a very sophisticated development and strategy plan. Luzon, one of their big islands, has only a 7% excess capacity which is well far below what they need. He is not only talking about how to explore and get natural resources, especially energy, but he's also looking at connecting up the islands and things like that. So this is not some sort of drop in the bucket plan, just throw it out there and see what happens. This is part of a very, very long-term strategy. And what it also does is it's a very, very clear signal that, with the U.S. retreating, unknowns about Donald Trump and where that policy is going, that China has become kind of the de facto player in the region. Now, obviously, Japan has put their oar in the water on this. It's also been offered to Russia in terms of let's, coordinate our activities. But with the disputed area and things like that, China is really the only game in town, and I think it's very important that people realize that this is a game changer.
Yeah, Professor Haydarian, according to the Philippines Foreign Secretary, the Philippine side is working on a doable legal framework over the joint exploration plan with China, as you also mentioned just now. So what kind of legal challenges are we looking at here, and is it possible to be overcome anytime soon in the near future so that this joint exploration plan can go ahead as planned?
Well, there are two dimensions to that. The first dimension is precedence. Back in 2005, China, the Philippines, and Vietnam signed the Joint Maritime Seismic Undertaking, which was very similar to mine right now. But by 2008, it expired, and the Philippines refused to renew that in light of domestic opposition. There were concerns that the JMSU was unconstitutional, that there was no sufficient, per Philippine Constitution, consultation between the executive branch and other major stakeholders, including the Congress and the communities that will be affected, and other kind of stakeholders. There was also a concern that the JMSU was signed under suspicious circumstances. There was a specific clause of secrecy. So for that reason, the precedence unfortunately has created some sort of baggage. So whenever you talk about joint exploration or joint development in the South China Sea, immediately people are going to talk about the Arroyo administration era of the JMSU. So that political baggage is something that we have to deal with, and I think that's where there is some political sensitivity around this issue. But I think the more serious issue is actually the substance of law. The Philippine Constitution, if you look at Article 7, Section 2, the National Economy and Patrimony Provision, makes it very clear that any exploration or development of natural resources within the Philippines Exclusive Economic Zone has to be directly supervised by the Philippine state, and in situations whereby there will be some sort of joint venture, the majority of the joint venture has to be owned by a Filipino side, and most importantly, the Philippine sovereignty should be recognized by the foreign entity. So this is what happened in Malampay. American companies like Chevron were involved in the development of the Malampay plant within the Philippines Exclusive Economic Zone. Obviously, when it comes to China, China claims sovereignty over this area. So I don't know how we're going to get around that, short of amending the Philippine Constitution. Now, President Duterte has a supermajority in the Congress, and I think that's what he'll likely push for, some amendment. And the second issue is the Philippine arbitration case, because per the Philippine arbitration case, China and the Philippines have no overlapping exclusive economic zone. So why should we have joint development? So Duterte has to set aside the Philippine Arbitration Award and amend the Philippine Constitution to get around the legal obstacles of this.
What's the likelihood is Duterte clearing the obstacles anytime soon? We're talking about the project starting next year, so we just have a couple of months. And if you were talking about amending the Constitution, that's like a huge effort. Given the popular support he already has, does he still have enough power to push it through?
Well, his popularity is very high. It actually went higher. It's because of his tough or perceived tough response to the ISIS threat in Marawi, in Mindanao. So he has a popularity. The lower house of the Congress is very much with the president. It's almost a rubber stamp chamber. The upper house, where the senators are, could be some problem. Duterte has some majority there, but it's a slim majority. So I think, going for a full-scale joint development will be a very difficult task unless President Duterte really invests his political capital. I think he will need to give a major major speech or give several major speeches and do a lot of backdoor negotiation with senators, including senators who are independent, senators who are a little bit skeptical of China, closer to the United States, and of course a member of the opposition. There are 5 or 6 of them in the Senate, which is composed of 24 members. So it's going to be a little bit difficult, just to put it mildly, but it's not entirely impossible.
Yeah,
I think if President Duterte really comes up with a good narrative of explaining that this is the only way that we can develop our resources without risking conflict and while improving our relations with China, then maybe we have to amend our constitution. Remember, he's amending the Philippine constitution to make it federal. So he can actually put into the federalism reform also amendments to those provisions that are very restrictive. And
let's see what's going to happen in the Philippines.
So it's doable. In theory, it's doable.
We hope so. But here on the Chinese side, the response has been very interesting. Aina, I'm sure you have noticed, for instance, there is no official media reports about these joint exploration plans. However, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has responded positively, saying it has always been China's policy to shelving the differences for now, but exploring the resources together. How do you look at the subtlety with which China is approaching the subject?
Well, I think subtlety is the right word. China is not coming down like a hammer and tongs saying, we won, we've got the Philippines to agree. And I disagree a little bit with my colleague's assessment. I think there are other ways to deal with this. If it is a private investment arm that is invested by the Chinese government, there are other ways to finesse this so that you don't have to go through the arduous process of doing a constitutional change. A lot of that has to do with the origin or the perceived origin of whatever the corporation that's involved is doing that. So I think China is taking a very, very cautious approach. This is a big win for China in terms of creating a very good atmosphere for going forward. It's very practical, and this is going back to the times of the changing over from the ideological to the practical under Deng Xiaoping.
Well, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much, and we'll keep a close watch on the situation. Many thanks again to Professor Richard Heydarian in Manila and Aina Tangan, as usual, current affairs commentator in Beijing. And here is my first point. According to media reports, the Philippine Defense Minister Delfin Lorenzana told a congressional hearing that the two countries had reached a modus vivendi, or a way to get along in the South China Sea. President Duterte, who took office in June last year, has a reputation of being a pragmatist, and as such, the two sides have been able to find a pragmatic way to deal with an issue of principle. This joint exploration project is commercial only, and the differences over sovereignty will be shelved until final resolution could be found through negotiations. That's something that are in the interest of both countries. And you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be back right after this. Negotiators from Canada, Mexico and the United States kicked off an ambitious first round of trade talks Wednesday as the countries try to fast-track a deal to modernize the North American Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, by early next year. The first round of talks is expected to focus on consolidating the proposals and demands from all three countries. What challenges are the negotiators faced with, and will a NAFTA 2.0 bridge profound differences among the three countries? For more on the topic, I'm pleased to be joined from Washington, D.C. by Dr. Gary Huffbauer, Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and from Ottawa, we have Mr. Colin Robertson, Vice President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Huffbauer, now Donald Trump was very critical of NAFTA in the 2016 campaign, and Hillary Clinton actually also promised NAFTA reforms. What's wrong with the existing NAFTA in the eyes of the Americans?
Well, there's not much wrong in the eyes of many economists, including myself. I think it's been a terrifically good agreement with tremendous benefits to all three countries. But in the eyes of President Trump and his senior negotiators, that would be Secretary Ross and Ambassador Lighthizer, the main things that are wrong are, one, the U.S. has a trade deficit with Mexico of about $60 billion a year, and in the past had a trade deficit with Canada, but no longer. But this trade deficit issue is the very big item. A second item is that they are concerned that some of the provisions in NAFTA erode U.S. sovereignty. I don't take this seriously, but they do. They think the arbitration panels that review anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases are somehow erode U.S. sovereignty and are not a good idea. And then they have very specific issues where they want either Canada or Mexico to liberalize their markets for U.S. goods and services, but they don't really have much in mind for liberalizing the U.S. market for Canadian goods and services or Mexican goods and services. So that's kind of the litany of claims. They have a feeling, that is, I'm going back to President Trump and his associates, they have a feeling that somehow NAFTA hammered in an adverse way the U.S. manufacturing sector. I don't think that's correct, but they think that's correct, and they think they can bring jobs back to places like Ohio and Michigan by renegotiating NAFTA.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what they have in mind.
Sure. Mr. Robertson, what's the Canadian take? How does the Canadian side look at the NAFTA and the US's, or the concerns in the eyes of the US administration?
Well, I think Gary has presented the picture as we see it in Canada extremely well, why the United States is there. I think from the Canadian perspective, the NAFTA has worked very well. It is publicly quite popular in Canada. Freer trade was a contentious issue in Canada prior to the negotiation of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement in 1988. But since then, across the board, there's broad support, broad public support, which is not reflected the same way in the United States by the public. But Canadians feel trade has worked for them. And so our government goes into this negotiation with strong public support and strong support also on most issues from the major opposition party. The very fact that we're at the negotiating table is already, I think, from a Canadian perspective, a success, because as Dr. Huffbauer pointed out, when Mr. Trump campaigned, he was going to tear up the NAFTA on his first day. It was the worst deal ever negotiated. But fortunately, I think a combination, particularly pressure from the farm community in the United States and from both sides of the aisle in Congress, as well as Canadian and Mexican Prime Minister and President, the United States is at the table, and I am confident that we will update the North American Free Trade Agreement, create a 2.0, and it will not be substantially different from what we negotiated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the United States.
Are you sure that you are going to have a deal that's...
And Mexico.
Yeah, are you sure that the Canadian sides will come out with a deal that's acceptable to the Canadian people, to the Canadian business? Because Trump is, doing this basically to get the most out of this, by talking very tough in advance, and something we have observed in his behavior almost as a pattern. So, yeah, Mr. Robertson, don't you think that, Canada is going in, and together with Mexico, are really going into this under a lot of pressure from the United States, whereas you originally wouldn't want to go into this kind of negotiation?
Well, as Dr. Huffbauer pointed out, our trade balance is virtually equal, and we have a slight advantage, particularly in energy trade, but it's that energy that fuels the manufacturing revolution that President Trump wants to create. So and that's a sense in a wash on that front. On the market access, the Americans wanting to gain more access, as Dr. Huffbauer pointed out, there's give and take. We will be asking for things on the American side as well. What will be really important for us and for the Mexicans, of course, is going to be to maintain a dispute settlement mechanism that is beyond the American courts. This was our driver to get into the original Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. It was agreed and carried into the NAFTA. It is something that the Trump administration has indicated they want to remove on countervail and anti-dump. That will be very important for us. I am confident that we can work something out, though, that will provide an arbitration panel that will be beyond the American courts, that may be slightly reformed from what we're doing now. No, I think that the very fact that the Trump administration is at the table and Mr. Trump wants to do a deal, I think that we probably will do a deal. There will be bumps along the way. It would not surprise me if at one point or another Canada or Mexico were to walk out. I think the unknown in all of this is Mr. Trump himself, but for now he seems to be interested in doing a new deal.
Yeah, Dr. Hofbauer, the U.S. wants the new deal as early as possible, basically in a matter of months. Is this possible at all? I mean, normally trade deals take years to hammer out. And what would happen if it doesn't work out that way?
Well, I don't think it's possible, given the demands that the U.S. has put on the table and given the very predictable Canadian and Mexican response. So the only way this could be concluded by Christmas 2017, if the U.S. withdraws all these strong demands that we've already talked about, or if Mexico and Canada capitulate and accede to those demands. I think either of those outcomes is very unlikely. And besides, you have to keep in mind that Trump gets a big political payoff by attacking NAFTA, a big political payoff in his base, white workers in the upper Midwestern states. So, you know, why not just keep on negotiating into 2018 and maybe beyond, but not settling for a small deal as he would view it. So I'm very skeptical that we are going to conclude this. I know everybody is, all the officials have said they want to conclude it by December, and I'm sure they want to conclude it and enjoy Christmas. I don't think that's going to happen.
Mr. Robertson, what is the estimate on the Canadian side about the kind of duration of negotiations you're ready to engage in?
Well, I think Gary's right. From the Canadian side, we're not pressed. It was, after all, it was Mr. President Trump who raised the whole idea, and the fact we're at the table. Now, the Mexicans have a challenge because of their presidential election next July, and they would not like this to intrude into that side of it. On the American side, they tell us, and Gary can speak to this, the Trade Promotion Authority that enables the president to complete this negotiation expires at the end of next June, next July, and then of course there's the midterms next November. From Canadian perspective, we don't have another election until 2019. We're not rushed, and in the meantime the current free trade arrangement continues to apply. We're involved in other discussions on contentious issues, softwood lumber, but that will run on a separate track. As Gary points out, though, these negotiations tend to take a long time. Even the North American Free Trade Agreement, where everybody was very much in a sense well coordinated, and we had just done the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement a couple of years before, that still took a couple of years plus. And then of course there's the implementation process for all the parties, which usually takes at least another year.
Mm-hmm. Another technical term, let me get that also clear from Dr. Hofbauer maybe. What would happen if, you know, we don't have a new NAFTA agreement by the end of the year as the president wanted? Will he withdraw from the current agreement, or will he, you know, just extend and wait really for things to happen?
I am very skeptical that he will withdraw, although he's threatened that both in the campaign and even as president he's threatened to withdraw. The reason he won't withdraw is that Congress, many members of Congress, both senators and representatives, are very, very opposed to withdrawal. They like the agreement like it is. And Congress in our constitutional system really has the final say on trade matters, although it is delegated a lot of statutory powers to the president. He would make so many congressmen, especially as Colin mentioned, the farm senators, the farm representatives, but many others as well, just furious at him if he were to withdraw, because their constituents depend on this agreement for both exports and imports that are their livelihood. So I'm quite skeptical about the withdrawal option, but I can see he could continue, as Colin said, to maybe attack it, have very strong rhetoric as the negotiations go forward, complaining that both Canada and Mexico are not doing what they should do, and so forth and so on.
Yeah. 1 minute left, Mr. Robertson. Now, the Canadian ambassador has said that the negotiation could be a win-win-win for all three countries. Given Trump's America First attitude, do you think it will be a win-win-win for all of you?
Well, trade traditionally is win-win-win. A trade negotiation is. So, yes, I am optimistic, but I am also recognize that there's a lot of imponderables in this, the first of which would be President Trump himself.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to go, and we'll keep a close watch on the developing situation. Many thanks, Dr. Gary Hofbauer at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and to Mr. Colin Robertson, Vice President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. And here is my last point. The Trump administration will find that time to renegotiate NAFTA is very short. NAFTA took 3 years to negotiate, and many trade experts believe negotiating a new and significantly different deal in 5 months is virtually impossible. Mexico needs to get agreement by the end of this year, as it has presidential elections coming up, and the current president cannot run again due to term limits. The leading presidential candidate, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has already said he would get tough on trade with the U.S. And as we heard, Canadians also have plenty of complaints about the U.S. So how to reach a deal within a few months' time? The answer is elusive to me. Let's keep watching the situation. And that's all from this edition of The Point here on CGTN. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.